From the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically, beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments directly on whatever platform you're watching on. They'll appear here in my chat room and we can talk. So, yesterday, I took part in a lovely psychic fair at the Unity Church in Urbana, Illinois, close to Danville. It was a lovely day, a lovely event. Lovely people, got to meet many new people, and I'd like to say hello to any of those people who may be watching, and particularly to Mark and Dawn, otherwise known as the Eagle and Unicorn, who I got to meet yesterday, and they told me that they regularly watch the midday broadcast. So that certainly made my day, and I hope that that you're having a lovely day today. And my subject for today is based on an article that Sir Edward had published on his page yesterday, I think, on what would we do if society became less friendly to us as pagans and witches. And I wanted to discuss that. I was hoping that people watching may have some comments as well. And I thought I might also bring up some of the comments I've seen. I've seen it on Sir Edward's page. I've seen it. It's gone to a number of places. Excuse me. It's an interesting article, and I think that it's an interesting subject that we are well advised to discuss. But I would also say, and hello to Lynn in the chat room. It's good to see you, Lynn. I'd say we've been discussing this subject as long as I've been discussing anything, because when we come down to it, what the question really is here isn't exactly what we would do if society became less friendly to us, but who are we and what do we want in life? Because the answer to the question, what do we do if society were less friendly, is entirely dependent on how we see ourselves and what we want from life. And as I look at the answers people make to this article, a lot of them seem to be speaking purely from a personal kind of hobbyist point of view. Which I guess if that's where you are is fine. And hello to Tom in the chat room. It's good to see you, Tom. But I mean, to me, it raises the question, are we just a bunch of individuals pursuing individual interests? Or are we, in fact, a community, a society, a culture of our own? I have always felt that I belonged to a distinct subculture. I certainly belong to a distinct religion, which has been here for some time. Um, I definitely belong to a particular society. And when I look at this, and in fact, when I look at all political questions, I look at it from that point of view. It's not just a question of what is comfortable for me, but what is going to be good for the future of that society? What is going to guarantee there is a future for that society? Because if I were just an individual, I could have lived my life very differently. Um, and certainly would have made certain decisions differently because would only have been interested in my own circumstances. But that has never been my criteria. And I think that for most of us, it cannot be our criteria, not if we wish um, to be part of something larger than just ourselves. Um, and when you are making your decisions based on the future of a community, they're not always such easy decisions. Sometimes they're difficult, sometimes they're painful, because you have to consider what is going to shore up the foundation and what is not. What is going to allow you to continue to go forward, what is not. When we look at the question, what would we do if society made it less friendly to be pagan or Wiccan or metaphysical in general, because we're all tied together, whether we like it or not. And hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. I think we have to bear in mind that not only are we talking about the subculture that we belong to, but a number of interconnected subcultures, some of which might not immediately appear to be affected by the situation, and some of which we might not immediately consider ourselves affected by, but in fact, they all affect each other. Um, when we think of our pagan community, for example, its role in society, the level of acceptance it receives in society is directly related to how other minority groups are treated, whether we want to think of it that way or not. And, I've seen pagans who don't care about how other minority groups are treated or may even be anti certain groups, not realize they're cutting out their own rights while they do it because we're all very connected legally, whether we even wish to be connected or not. The precedents that are brought to restrain one minority community are certainly going to be used on another. And the ways that one minority community are successfully able to resist that can be used by all. Hello to Kazan in the chat room. It's good to see you. I've seen a lot of people whose reaction to this question, what would we do if society were less friendly to us as pagans, is, well, we'd go into the broom closet, um, like we did before. And I've got news for you, that's not going to work. It's not going to work for a number of reasons, including the fact it didn't work all that well in the first place. Um, it could maybe work if you don't live any aspect of what you claim to believe, if you don't show who you are in any way. Um, I'm not sure what the point of living that way would be personally. I think that if the things we believe mean anything to us, the idea that we're all going to be terribly, terribly secret is very foolish. Um, but equally, in the modern era, the idea that that's even possible is relatively foolish. It's also important to remember that when it comes to persecution of religious minorities, and I would say even maybe specifically pagan minorities, it isn't necessarily whether you're actually a pagan that matters. It's whether you are a conformist, whether you are objecting to anything happening in society, it's whether you are um, someone who's not willing to be told everything they need to do to live. I'll remind you that within living memory, we had people who thought it was completely appropriate to legislate people's private love lives in their bedrooms, um, in their marriages, um, who thought that, for example, something like oral sex should be just completely illegal, no matter who you were, and had some success in pursuing this. Um, I mean, that's how extreme the people who are unfriendly to our community are willing to be. Are we really willing to let them go that far? Because, every step is a step farther. Um, and some of them are trying very hard right now. And yeah, they're not particularly focusing on pagans, but do you think they're not going to? Um, and do you think that the things being brought against, for example, the LGBT community, aren't going to affect our community too? Do you think that these are not things we should be concerned with? Are we going to wait till they're knocking on our door before this is a matter of concern to us? Um, for a lot of our community, the answer is obviously yes. And even then, they don't intend for it to be a matter of concern to them. They think they're just going to keep their door closed and be fine. Um, some of you who are watching this will remember the Satanic Panic. I was publicly Wiccan during the entire Satanic Panic. I was publicly Wiccan before it began. I was publicly Wiccan while it happened. I was publicly Wiccan afterwards. Um, but there were some ridiculous things happening. And it is worth saying that most of the people who experienced actual persecution in that era certainly were not Wiccan. Um, were not even the Satanists they were being accused of being. They were just easy targets. Um, but does that make it better? But it, and even though they were the people bearing the greater brunt of it, the actual metaphysical communities found themselves in positions of a great deal of fear at that time. And that's not a way to live. In case anyone has forgotten about the Satanic Panic, and I recommend you don't because it wasn't very long ago, it was started by a woman who, if I remember correctly, was diagnosed as schizophrenic, making accusations which turned out to be completely false, were obviously false on the face of them, and yet ended up being taken seriously because certain people wanted to take them seriously. If you look at most of the accusations that occurred during the Satanic Panic, large numbers of them could not have been true. I remember, I think it was the McMartin Day School case. Hello to Jeanette in the chat room. One of the accusations was that the staff of this preschool took all of their little students on a jet plane trip to another city where they had a multi-hour orgy and then flew back to the first city. And this was actually brought to court despite the fact that the plane trip alone would have taken longer than the course of the school day. It was not something that could have happened. And yet they went ahead and prosecuted it because it was in the interest of the DA to build her electability. If I remember correctly, her name was Leah DiAugustino. I have never forgotten her name because it was obvious the charge could not be true, but she brought it. Um, there's a lot here, far more than I'm going to get into in the 15 minutes I have left. But when we talk about society becoming less friendly to us, we need to remember that it wasn't very long ago that we had this experience. And yes, it didn't go to the worst extremes, and in many ways, it never actually physically impacted most of our community, but it did lead to a situation. What was it? The Memphis Three, I believe they were called. There was a group of young teenagers who were involved in Wicca who found themselves accused of horrible crimes, which once again, there were all sorts of all sorts of evidence that they could not have been the people who did it, but they still found themselves charged with it because of what people believed um, about the movement they were part of, and the fact that they were not all that deep into the actual community. These are things that we need to be mindful of. And if we sit back and just allow the forces that would like to see us gone to take the actions necessary to do that, well, we can't complain if they later do it. Um, and we're watching them do it now. I've talked about this many times in my career, and I've often gotten a lot of pushback from this community who don't seem to want to hear it. But look at what's happening in the world and think back 20 years, and don't tell me it can't happen. Things we would not have thought could happen are happening, and what's going to stop them from getting worse? Well, the answer is the only thing that we can do to make a difference to that is ourselves try to stop them from getting worse. So there are lots of things we can do. One of them is to stand up for the things we believe in. Another is to take control of our own image, which I talk about a lot, and show people who we really are. rather than allowing ourselves to be portrayed by others. Another is to have an interest in politics and pay some attention to what's happening um, from a point of view centered on our own religion and its needs. I find a lot of people in our community seem to take that very much for granted. And Crystal, hello to Crystal Moon in the chat room, and she says yes, the West Memphis Three. They're one of a couple of examples of situations like this. So it did, to some extent, actually hit our community, although um, in many ways we were very fortunate. We also, of course, have magic. And, I've been part of a long-term peace campaign. And, you look around the world and you say to yourself, well, was that a waste of time? And the answer is no, because who knows where we'd be if we hadn't done it, if we weren't doing it. Yes, it does look like peace is going straight down the drain, but on the other hand, it might be going much faster if no one were trying to maintain it. Same is true for civil rights. The same for our community and related communities. Um, if we don't take it seriously, we can't complain if we find we no longer have it. I am a great believer in what will probably be a controversial statement, but that is that rights are what you can hold. A right cannot be given. Either you have it or you don't. If it's given, it's a privilege. Um, so if you've got it, you need to maintain it. You need to hold on to it, and you need not to allow it to be taken from you. One of the stories that really influenced my life, um, I belonged to the Pagan Spirit Alliance before there ever was a Pagan Spirit gathering. And although I did not go to a Pagan Spirit gathering until the 1990s, I did have a pretty good vantage point at a distance for the early ones. And I remember there was one of the early ones where a group of people came to disrupt the event. A group of conservative Christians who were upset that there was a pagan gathering happening in the world. That's not really surprising. Um, what I remember the article saying, there were 300 people present at this gathering. But their reaction to this group of people trying to disturb them was that they all ran and hid in the woods and let Selena Fox and a handful of elders go and deal with the extremists. And I remember being horrified by that. What do you mean? You just abandoned the people who were putting everything together and let them go risk themselves while you hid in the woods. What do you think you're going to get from that behavior? And to anyone listening today, my answer to you is you go hide in the woods. Well, you've put yourself in a place where you can be easily hunted down later. Um, I do not think it's a good idea. I do not think it's an honorable idea. And I'm not saying that the 300 people should all have gone marching down to the disruptive people, but they should have been ready if they were needed, and they should have been willing if they were needed to do whatever was needed. And as a community, if we're not willing to make that kind of commitment, what on earth are we doing? What do we think the future is going to hold? Um, and granted, you can't always fight effectively against the forces of fate. Sometimes they have their reasons. Um, but I am not a magical person for that point of view. I believe very much that we can do what we set our minds to do. But what disturbs me sometimes is that I question how much our community has set its mind on a good future, and how many of them are just practicing emotional masturbation. And I think that what those of us in positions of influence need to do is to strongly encourage those who are building real community, real commitment, and a real future, um, and help to lift those people up. And the people who are basically just indulging the moment, well, that's fine for them, but that's something they need to do. But as a community, we need to build ourselves. We need to build our resources, and we need to know that the day may come we need to use them. We may need to have a way to move people from unsafe areas to safe areas. We may need um, to be able to provide physical defense for some people. It is not in the present era all that far removed from anything we might reasonably expect. It would be wonderful if it never happens, but as a community, we need to be thinking in those terms, among other terms. Now, going back to the example I gave, if you look at the story differently and say, well, instead of the 300 people all rushing down to confront the protesters, instead they sent a peace mission first and it was successful, well, that's great. Um, and like I say, if that had been exactly what happened, that would be perfectly fine. And of course, that's the first thing you always try to do. It's the hiding in the woods that bothers me. Always did. Um, and one of the things that I would say is that when the satanic panic came as a community, we did not hide in the woods. We engaged in education, we engaged in diplomacy, and we represented our own image. And we prevented ourselves from being tarred with a brush that was not about us. Um, it's one of the reasons that I sometimes get frustrated when people tend to blur our messages on who we are, because it's important that we be clear on who we are um, if we want to be reacted to as who we are. I talk extensively about controlling our own image. And now that we have all these media resources so easily at hand, we need to do that. Um, if we hide in the woods, we have no one to blame if we find ourselves alone later. And of course, there's the very famous poem by I believe his name was Nylander. He was a minister who was present in Nazi Germany. And he wrote the famous poem, when they came for the communists, I did nothing. When they came for the Jews, I did nothing. Um, when they came for a whole bunch of people, I did nothing. When they came for me, there was nobody to do anything. Um, that is very much something to pay attention to. You cannot wait till the last minute and think you're going to mount a defense. We need to be looking, not that we are in a um, a position where we must defend ourselves now, but that we could be, and that we wish to avoid that. How do we avoid it? We avoid it by now using the many peaceful means we have: diplomacy, publicity, um, media, just getting to know people. The very worst thing we could do is go hide in the woods. The worst thing we could do is go hide in the closet, um, because that will cause people not to know who we are. And if they don't know who they are, they're going to fantasize about who they are. And hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. How are you, Ravenwolf? Um, so these are some of my thoughts on where I think we should be. But I've been saying them for more than a quarter century now. And I remember when Sarah Palin was running for vice president. And for those of you who don't remember, she completely completely supported the idea of African witch hunts. Um, was very religiously conservative, was the worst thing we could ever ask to have in office as a community. Had nothing to do with her party, had to do with her religious beliefs, had to do with the religious people backing her who were very public. And yet I had pagans tell me, well, they were going to vote for her because they liked her. She's being blessed by active witch hunters in this country, and you're going to vote for her? What kind of fucking idiot are you? If you'll pardon my language. But that was exactly the case, because if you're going to vote for someone who's going to eliminate you, you're an idiot. Um, Today, I don't think anyone remembers that about her. Um, but that's true for a lot of people running an office right now who come from certain backgrounds. Um, they have backing from religious figures who have no um, respect for our community, even for its mere existence. And we need to remember that and not pretend it isn't so. Hello to Elvira in the chat room. Um, and I realize that the people who probably ought to listen to me are not going to, but when it's time to vote, as a member of a minority community, the thing that should matter most to you is what standing your community is going to have in an administration handled by the person you're voting for. Um, are you going to still have rights? And one of the things, one of the books that I might still have from my library, I might not. It was called Mask of the Swastika. It was written after the Second World War. It was written by a Jewish gentleman who had been a child in the interwar years, and his family had escaped Germany. And after the war, he went back to Germany to speak to some of the people he had known before the war and just see what their experiences had been and how they felt about it all after the fact. Um, and there were some fascinating stories. One of the stories was about a woman described as the Baroness Musselein von Westerode, which was not her real name. Um, but she had tried to educate people about some of the things the Nazis were very clearly planning to do because they said it, and she couldn't convince anyone. They kept saying, well, that could never happen here. We can go ahead and elect them with confidence because, I mean, this is just propaganda. They're not really going to do it. And hello to Joshua in the chat room. Hello to George in the chat room. Um, and this defines something that you hear a lot from pre-Nazi Germany. A lot of people thought that Hitler and the Nazis were just talking, that it was just propaganda, that they didn't really intend to do any of it. Well, there's a saying that people will tell you who they are, and you do well to listen. When people tell you that their goal is to eliminate you and your community, you should listen to them. Because there's no reason to think that this is just hyperbole. Um, and Joshua says, um, Joshua compares it to Highlander, the idea that there can be only one in the end, that certain movements have that attitude that there's only room for them. And we need to be mindful of that because we're not them for the most part. And we need to make sure that the world continues to have room for us, and we won't do it by going into a closet. We won't do it by hiding in the woods. Um, we will do it by continuing to stand for a free society and doing so to the best of our ability. But we need to realize that these are real things. And George says, this has been a very enlightening chat today. You know, for the most part, pagans at present are in a very good position. Because of that, a lot of them tend to forget things like the Satanic Panic. And, the people I was talking to about Sarah Palin a few years ago, they weren't worried because they couldn't remember having ever really faced serious discrimination. But the truth is, you don't have to think back that far. I first became publicly pagan in like 1976. I was 13 years old and had no particular problems from it. But I don't know that that was particularly common. Um, so when the Satanic Panic happened, I was rather surprised by it, rather shocked by it. I wouldn't be shocked to see it come again. I would not be shocked by it ever again because I saw how easily it could happen and how people were willing to embrace it, even though it was obviously false. And that's the thing that we as a community need to remember, um, that when people want to believe a certain thing, the truth does not matter to them necessarily. And hello to Jade in the chat room. And Elvira says, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. I think that in the end is what I'm saying, that whether or not society becomes less friendly to us as pagans or Wiccans, we must remember that it could, and we must stand for the things we believe in. And if we don't, we can't really complain if things go badly. If we hide in the woods, alone among some trees, we can't be surprised if, when we need help, we are simply alone. We need to stand together. So that's my thought for the day. I hope you find it interesting. And until next time, um, have a lovely day. I'll see you again tomorrow when we'll talk about probably a more cheerful subject. So, with that, let us close with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us to be mindful of the things that are important in our lives. Help us to be mindful of the importance of our community and our interactions with others, and the importance of standing up for ourselves and our loved ones, and not allowing ourselves to be badly used. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for this and all that you do in our lives, and knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And again, I will see you